Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Guvanj, and welcome to What's Wrong with the podcast. And today we have the great pleasure of chatting with Nzinga Mboup. Nzinga is a Dakar-based Senegalese architect who co-founded WOROFILA, a practice that specializes in bioclimatic architecture and construction using earth and biomaterials sourced locally. In addition to her architectural practice, Nzinga has worked as a researcher for the African Futures Institute and co-authored 2 research projects called Habiter Dakar and Dakarmorphose that investigate the problematics of housing, heritage, and identity in the city of Dakar. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to What's Wrong with the podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with the co-founder of WOROFILA, Nzinga Mboup. Nzinga, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Pinar.
Thank you for coming. We've been very much looking forward to this conversation, so I'm so glad we're making it happen. Please tell us more about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I am, my name is Nzinga Biegueng Mboup. I am a Senegalese architect. I live and work in Dakar, Senegal. And I studied in South Africa. My undergraduate studies were at the University of Pretoria. I then worked for 2 years in Johannesburg at a practice called 2610 South. And later on moved to London, UK in order to pursue my master's at the University of Westminster, and then worked for 3 years at AG Associates before returning back to my country of origin, which is Senegal. And since I've been there, I first met a collective of architects that was then the collective WOROFILA, which later on progressed into the practice that we have today, which specializes in bioclimatic architecture and the use of local materials in the reflection around passive buildings and making also much more contextual and sustainable living environments. And outside of, so WOROFILA today is 9 to 10 people practice, and we've been able to do quite a few buildings and projects, often in collaboration as well with other architects, institutions, working with the state, private clients, of course. And outside of it, I'm also a researcher. Since going back to Senegal, I've been involved in a series of research projects. 2 in particular, based in Dakar with other architects, one called Dakar-based and the other Habiter Dakar, that sort of take an interest in our history and heritage when it comes to the built environment, to question and understand what our architectural traditions are, and kind of have a critical outlook at it in order to think about the architectural models of the future. And I've also worked for 2 years. I used to work for the African Futures Institute as a researcher, and then also was a participant at the Venice Biennale, and in 2023, where I produced a film on urban architecture. And lastly, I've now been appointed as a curator for the CO Dakar program, which is done with the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and will last 3 years. And the focus will be to investigate what the architectural traditions of Senegal are.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, looking at your work today, your background makes even much more sense. You know, like you can totally tell that you come from like a very research-driven background. And I have huge admiration towards WOROFILA's approach in how the solutions are very much authentic to the local needs, whether that's for people or for the environment. For myself and for the audience, can you describe what bioclimatic architecture is in more detail?
Okay, so bioclimatic architecture is really an approach towards the design of buildings to ensure that they are made and conceived with the geography in mind. I say geography because it usually provides us 2 key criteria. It's the climate, number 1, in which we are working. the site as well, and all the site conditions, from soil condition to the type of plants that we see on it, or if in an urban context, looking at what is around it. And then the second biggest tenet of bioclimatic architecture is it's the materials that we use, ensuring that we use materials that are biogenic or geogenic, what people call natural materials, and use them in a way that is adequate to the climate. So in the context, let's say, of Senegal, where we are in a mostly hot country, we are preoccupied with ensuring that buildings that we produce are cool and provide cooling. And that is done by ensuring that when we orientate a building, we try to prevent solar radiation. And this is something that we do by just observing the direction of the sun, the incidence of the solar rays, etc. And then one thing that is very important as well in orientation is to look at the prevailing winds, and particularly ensuring that we position openings in a way that we have natural ventilation and allow for the cooler winds to go through the spaces and participate in the cooling of the building. And the use of the biomaterials, natural materials such as raw earth, play a big role in also allowing for the amount of dehumidification of the air, especially when it's hot and humid, to ensure that the building can self-regulate itself. Yeah, that's in a few words how I could illustrate what the approach towards bioclimatic architecture is.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much in my mind, how I like wrap it up is you have nature and the environment itself as like the biggest stakeholder, right? Whether it's responding to the needs or the conditions that it has at present, or utilizing what's available at the local in terms of materials. One question I would have, and I feel like what we also see maybe in both, maybe at your local too, and I would love your thoughts on that, but definitely also on the global scale, is how this approach might also scale, right? I think what we see in kind of today's maybe architectural or built environment landscape in general, there are incredible case studies that we can learn from, similarly to your projects. And obviously we also realize, a lot of the scale calls for kind of both like a top down push, but as well as like bottom up push, right? So the top down, which are maybe the regulations or government incentives and things like that, are happening, but what we don't necessarily have much control over, right? Like we hope for that to happen, and hopefully we advocate for that to happen. But the bottom up is really how we practice. And like it would be wonderful to see like many, many, many more WOROFILAs like across the world, like really addressing to the local needs. But we don't see it yet. And I would love to get your thoughts on kind of like some of the things that are maybe the difficulties around practicing such an approach, and which might be also getting in the way of increasing that bottom-up push of these efforts from architectural practices.
I think one of the biggest, I mean, you touched on a few of the elements that are preventing, I think, a much more generalized approach towards bioclimatic architecture. But I think maybe the biggest thing is education. Because especially, I mean, as architects, we usually are trained in universities, and we're trained with certain paradigm in mind about how is it that we're supposed to make space. So there's a very distinctive kind of history of architecture that is taught to us. A lot of it in terms of the constructive systems sort of tend to start or the heritage of, I guess, the Industrial Revolution. So the use of steel, reinforced concrete, glass, other form of metal are really the kind of like center materials that we are taught to build with, at the detriment of other maybe older techniques such as building with stone or with earth or with any type of fibers, which funny enough, it actually technologies that exist all around the world. Whenever you look at any type of vernacular architecture around the world, it does show you how to work with the materials that you actually find in the geography and to work with it in adaptation to the climate, whether you are in the sort of, you know, in the Arctic, or, you know, where there's only ice and water, or, you know, live in the forest where it's hot and humid. Like, there's always been these examples of traditions of building that are in adequation with the climate. So I think there's a sort of like shift again, you know, in this kind of globalized post-industrial world in which we're quite detached from the process as well of the fabrication of the materials. This is all, you know, I don't think many of us, even as architects today, could actually be able to really trace the full supply chains of the materials that we use. And also, I don't think we really question many of the premise of our architectural education. When it comes to, let's say, for instance, passive design technology, there's been for instance, I've been trained between, let's say, the South Africa and the UK, but we've kind of had this heritage of always having to insulate the facade in order to provide thermal cooling, and not really thought necessarily about how the thermal inertia, let's say, of an envelope that you get through volume of solid materials, how that can contribute to the comfort. Is always, okay, how can we make the wall thinner? And then add this insulation, which is usually a type of industrial product, often, you know, plastic derived or petroleum derived, in order to insulate it. And that is done, I think, to the profit of, you know, space, because yeah, we live in a world where there's a kind of increasing pressure on the earth. The economy of space is a consideration, and then there's also the kind of I would say outlet for certain materials. In that sense, I think architectural education makes us kind of have, or how could I say it, continue a certain tradition of building with industrial products, and not really one where you can just essentially go just through nature and really take the materials and build with it. It has to be, yeah, part of the whole ecosystem. And I think that impoverishes the way in which our realm of possibilities when it comes to architecture, and for sure reinforces what we tend to see everywhere, which is an architecture that requires a lot of energy later on in order to actually have a certain thermal comfort. And even worse part, which we don't ever think about, is the kind of amount of waste that it generates as well, because we know how to put buildings together, but we don't know how to actually put them, disassemble them, and never think about what they will become afterwards. So yeah, I think it really stems from, number one, education, and then afterwards there are other considerations such as knowledge systems, how well they've been preserved in the place or not, the availability of labor, the cost of labor as well, and also, yeah, regulations for sure, which tend to impose certain criteria that make the use of, let's say, natural materials a lot harder.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is that, like, once you get out of your architectural education at the present, you almost need to do a little bit of unlearning to like go back to like the roots. And it is kind of like, I mean, it is frustrating, and we do see this in other industries as well, right? Like, one analogy I have in mind is kind of like the food industry, where we had kind of like the hype of fast food, and it was like the glory days. And I remember my childhood, like, you know, that was like fascinated by things like a McDonald's. And then we were like, oh wait, these are not actually good for us, let's go back a little bit. And then we have the trend of like organic, which is maybe like today's, like, I don't know, LEED certification in like US.
Yeah.
And then maybe from there, even like just elimination of just bad stuff from our diet. And I feel like architecture is needing to go through that, but it's like much slower, obviously, because there are a lot of like not only learned like habits or behaviors to our like education, but also probably a lot of push towards making space for what is available in the industry.
Yeah.
So some of these, you know, what you were mentioning in terms of like concrete, like steel, like these are huge industries with huge I guess, lobbying power too, right? And I
Mhm.
think um, we almost kind of need to see them also shifting into exploration of like other materials and things like that, for like, as similarly how we see more initiatives from like oil and gas into like natural resources, the more we're seeing like it opens up like regulation, like also in like especially in US. And I'm curious, at your local, like in Senegal, do you see any kind of like work together with maybe like a firm like yours, with like local governments, with maybe like material companies or construction companies,
Mhm.
to kind of like find ways of making things like happen? Because I think yes, I definitely agree in terms of an architect's responsibility, and even like what you said, like questioning what like our practice, questioning the norms, being more considerate or curious about the supply chain,
Mhm.
being more mindful about our ways. Like there are a lot of responsibilities that architects need to take on. Um,
Mhm.
and but because architect does not necessarily have control of the entire medium, like
Mhm.
a lot of like players, what type of like collaboration are you do you see that works well, especially in your case in like Senegal,
Mhm.
where maybe there's like a combination of like exploration in like materials, or like openness to review diverse materials from like a local government side, or maybe like
Mhm.
local contractor or construction company being more open to explore a different approach?
Yeah, so we're quite lucky, I think, WOROFILA, because from the very beginning, from the moment we even existed as a collective, we've been quite lucky to actually be able to engage with the government, and also with programs that look particularly into the energy efficiency of buildings, and also the promotion of all the biomaterials. In Senegal, there's so the Ministry of Environment has they commissioned the building back in, I believe it was 2016, but then from about 2018, when the building got built, we, particularly the co-founder of WOROFILA, Nicolas, worked closely with the contractor in order to oversee the construction of it, and in doing so was able to also have engineer a lot of solutions in how both earth, but also TIFA can be used in construction. And the project was actually to make a demonstrative building. It's called the Eco Pavilion of Diamniadio, and the idea was to showcase what a series of buildings, because it's more like a complex of various buildings, could look like if you actually center both earth and TIFA as the main building materials, and also passive design systems as ventilated roofs, insulated facades, thick walls in the envelope, what do you call it, ventilated walls as well when we need to have ventilation, the use of patios. So there's a couple of design principles that were used there, and this was really done with the support of the state. And later on, they've been able to always keep us in a loop of various programs that they have in place, even though at this point they're mostly pilot programs. They haven't really reached a sort of kind of like large scale implementation, but there's been conversations, for instance, about using very simple software to do simulations of any project that will be built before it's granted a building permit. And in 2018, we participated to the training to learn how the software would work, the kind of data we sort of input in order to look at the thermal efficiency of a building. So programs like that, I think, are quite positive, and are showing that there's at least the interest, in the state to promote a much more sustainable approach towards building. Because at the end of the day, I think it's also realizing that it's better to sort of eliminate the need for solutions that we'll find later down the line. In our approach to sustainability, I think the question of economy and prevention is really critical, because there's sometimes the risk to use technology as a way to actually solve solutions of problems that never needed to exist in the first place.
Right.
That's very common, and that's also something that even in the conversation around like LEED, etc., there has to be a higher focus on prevention, and not just the fact that you're using green technology in order to provide clean energy, etc. If we don't need the energy, if we have lowered our heat loads in the building just by simple orientation or by the use of certain critical materials, then it's better down the line to not have to find yet another solution as green as people can claim that it is. So, and yes, another program that is also been quite good in doing that in Senegal is the Tikau program, which looks at how to promote this Tifa plant, which is an invasive species that grows on water bodies and has really great insulation properties, quite close to hemp. And but it literally grows everywhere in Senegal. It's created a lot of environmental catastrophes, but the state is trying to see how to promote it as a material that could be used in construction to make insulating panels, or to make to stabilize earth when we make adobes or earth renders as well. And the other thing is that it's also very good for coal because it's a slow burner. So there's been sort of calls to see how that could be used to replace timber or the fossil coal. And a little anecdote is that, yes, the cement industry also does use the TIFA as a fuel as well, as a way to kind of like reduce their embodied energy, which is,
I see. Yeah. I mean, I feel like you kind of need to start somewhere, right? Like as a state, you can support like a program, and it obviously has to start with like a case study project almost. Like you can't scale immediately. You need to learn from that. And with like the current like cement industry also, like they have to start somewhere in at least like doing less harm. I think even that mindset is a starting point. And it's almost like, we don't give enough space in built environment for us to have the mindset that the tech industry has, right? Like the tech industry just iterates, prototypes, launches a beta, scales it, learns from it, goes back. Like we try something, and if suddenly if it's too expensive or economically doesn't seem viable and to scale, we don't see that as like a learning, or like we don't see that as like, okay, this was the first iteration prototype. Obviously, it was expensive. How can this be more cost efficient, like down the road, right? So I think there's that, like, in addition to having more like a researcher mindset too, I think we need to have like a little bit more like testing, prototyping mindset in built environment as well. And I love what you said in terms of like just prevention, or even like designing less, like not over designing, create another problem to then like try to solve it through like technology. It's like almost like thinking of reducing before recycling or reusing, right? Let's just like consume less. But also the TIFA, like it's an excellent example of understanding the local like natural wealth you have almost, and see how you might incorporate it into into your work. And yeah, I think the biggest like also like thing, that question mark I have in my mind sometimes, like I think when we go back to how we didn't have the kind of like sustainable like building problem in the past, right? We just like worked with whatever we had. One thing that like today also a reality that gets in the way is the growing population, right? And so I mean, in addition to kind of like after just like industrialization, we're just like more efficiency, more money, more savings. So that obviously sparks a lot of these unnecessary like inventions that we have and materials we use, but also especially the denser living environments get, the more vertical we need to go, right? And how do you see natural elements can play a helpful factor if we still need to go vertical? Or how do you think it's like a way of like sustainable scaling also without kind of eliminating the local sources that we also had, because we just need to utilize in order to meet population needs? Especially I'm like interested in your thoughts in terms of like when it comes to obviously housing, or right, can these like local material incorporation can sustain for housing solutions, you think?
No, that's a really good point as you talk about the growing population and in Dakar in particular, because so Dakar is the most western city in Africa and kind of sits on the peninsula, but it's surrounded by water and has a sort of very limited space. It's practically an island. So as its population is growing and the sort of centrality of the capital grows in the country, because unfortunately there isn't as much investment in also developing the back of the country. So the cities are also growing. So there's often a kind of link there with people just flocking from the hinterlands and the rural areas. We're seeing an increased pressure on the land in Dakar, and an increased verticalization as well of all the built structures. Every day there's a house being demolished in order to make way for building. Now we have 4 stories buildings getting demolished, 6 stories buildings getting demolished to give rise to 12 stories buildings. So it keeps going up, and I think what that does as well is that it's having an impact on just the quality of the urban environment. I think there needs to be a greater consideration for how the artificialization, of the ground, for instance, the building on practically now, more than 90% of the parcel, how that has an impact on how we live. It creates a lot more of a heat island effect. We're having increasing floods as well, years after years. So there needs to be a kind of like critical outlook on how, yes, we're going to provide housing for the growing population, but we have to think very critically about the models and the ways in which we build in order to just continue to be able to have a certain degree of livability. And for us at WOROFILA, and also this was a result of one of the research projects that I've done called Habiter Dakar, because it particularly looks into housing in Dakar and how it could just be made to be more adequate to our context, our cultures, and our climate. We've also created one of our key projects is a sort of vertical housing typology called NKD House, and it sits in one of the original indigenous villages of Dakar in the area of Ngor. And it is a 4.5-story building. It is made in earth, and on a parcel that is about 150 square meters. And we were able to demonstrate how by respecting the sort of urban planning law and not building on more than 70% of it, we can create, make a building that is completely passive, naturally lit, naturally ventilated, by ensuring that we had patios, ensuring that most of the rooms had cross ventilation. So we really had just one facade on the road, and by creating patios on the inner side, we're able to create that natural ventilation. Also take advantage of the height in order to encourage a sort of stack effect by having a form of like chimney, ultimately I think up to 5 floors, that when you open on the ground floor you have air that is inflowing, and when you open on the top floor it kind of creates this draft and encourages the ventilation. Even in inserting a pool in the patio, the water also contributes to the cooling of the air. We also, I think, the main challenge in working with earth there was that because load-bearing earthen walls are actually quite thick, we had to also get quite creative on how to design the sort of envelope and see how we can create things like cupboards and all of that in the envelope in order to ensure that we have the stability that is required. And we really wanted to push as well and show how when you work with especially earthen bricks, the modularity of it as well allows for a range of constructive systems, like the use of vaults, for instance, for structural floors, the use of, on the facade, we have this sort of protruding bricks that also cast shade on the wall. So you sort of have a wall that is shaded for half of the day, and which reduce obviously the kind of heating load on them. And I think, yeah, it's just generally being able with the project to showcase that it is possible to have a very sort of modern contemporary building in the city while using these natural materials, and for people to also understand that it does require not just it's possible, but it also requires to sometimes adjust as well how we live. So we need to open the windows. We need to we've put ceiling fans instead of AC, of course. And in the use of solar panels, one thing that was very critical was to understand that it's best in our climate to use solar energy during the day when you have the sun, because when you do so, you actually do not rely on batteries, or you reduce your reliance on batteries, which, as we know, are probably one of the kind of weakest link of the use of solar energy, because they need to be replaced. They're not very recyclable, etc. So there was a bit of an educational component to also only put the amount of solar panels that were needed, mostly for night security use and the limited use, and everything else, like turning washing machines on, etc., should just happen mostly during the day. So I think that this was a really good project in showcasing that it is possible to build in the city, to build vertically as well, to also think about new models on how we can live in the city by living sustainably and yet comfortably at the end of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, I think, gems in there. Listening to first, like what I'm hearing also is almost the need of the decentralization of economic opportunities, right? Like if jobs are only accumulated in very dense urban cities, then more people are just going to come there and just putting pressure on the land and increasing a lot of problems for the land. Like I live in New York City, Manhattan is I'm pretty sure sinking. I think there's like information on that already. But you know, it is not sustainable. And yes, we go vertical, but how do we do that? Also, maybe at scale, and by at scale, we don't necessarily mean all of it is in one place, right? Like how do we do that in a nature-friendly way? Across the country. And I love this example that you shared, and also highlighting things around like maybe changing our like behavioral habits on like our like home living too, right? Like in terms of like and I think that's very like empowering in a way, because when we have these like big conversations around like climate change, typically for an everyday like consumer or user or like a person who is maybe not creating projects in this space, it is very sometimes it's very much complex to understand how to participate, or like what is even my role, right? Like we're doing these like big words out there, and a lot of it is like technical terms. So it's really hard to understand, well, what can I do? What is my part? And even like starting out with like daily behaviors and what you can do at your own home, I think that's very empowering. It's almost like in collaboration with the building itself. And I think it gives us more ownership uh of of our like environment that we're in. And I love the example you also shared on like, okay, now that you have like thick walls, how can that turn into like an opportunity, right? Like instead of immediately dissing like, oh, now we have like thicker walls, but no, maybe can we embed some of like the living or furniture needs into that, right? I think that's like that's a brilliant way of like talking about like creative opportunities that might come up with something, instead of like a change that you're seeing being like shut down immediately, and that can become its like own trend too. And like similarly on how we created many other trends years ago in like modern, let's say, architecture, right? So and today it's maybe like 4 stories, 4.5 stories, but like maybe in the future, as you work on more of these like prototypes, right, like it becomes 6, it becomes 8, and there's like more engineering expert collaboration on this to like make these things feasible. But we need to start somewhere. And because, you know, I think obviously the fact that sometimes regulations or policies really inhibit in the way, not only like zoning or like land use regulations, right, but Like, for example, in United States, even though we can go tall with maybe like more wood construction, insurance companies are getting in the way of that, for which is like very, like there is many ways you can make this like fireproof, right? But in the end, because that language is not embedded into some insurance policies, developers are hesitant to go that route, right? So how do these external players, like whoever is financing projects, banks, insurance companies, are also impacting design and design decisions, and how can we effectively all collaborate with each other to make more room for case examples that you're sharing, that may be, which is ironic, like may feel out of box today, but it was actually like very much common practice like maybe years ago,
Yeah,
right?
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've actually faced a similar kind of situation with a brief that we had last year, which was the first time we were working on an art institution, and understanding that with art institution there are very strict requirements, so for galleries and museums, around the temperature and relative humidity of the internal environment. And when you sort of place it in a sort of sub-Saharan African context, you find yourself having to really go above and beyond to meet those requirements, because people say that the guideline says, for instance, that the internal temperatures need to be 19 degrees Celsius. I think for most of us in Africa, we know that during the day we seldomly have that temperature naturally. So to be able to achieve that requires a lot of engineering. And I think we speak about it, particularly in the context of, let's say, like art and artifacts, that with the ones that sort of come from our context, they were never in these type of environments to begin with. It's there's a kind of this idea around conservation that was sort of fabricated, because the objects, I mean, this isn't food, the objects were never meant to be in those in that temperature. So where does the standard come from at the end of the day? And what is it upholding as a kind of even philosophy around how to engage with particularly with artwork. I've even asked, okay, you do a gallery that has those requirements, and then you showcase artwork that is going to be sold to people that maybe just have houses. Do the houses need to have similar requirements as well? Like, what is the general kind of ecology that we're trying to create here? So yeah, I mean, just to kind of give an example, and with that particular situation, I was even reading up on history of places in Europe, and trying to think about the places and museums that do not have air conditioning, all the cathedrals in which many of the artwork has been for centuries, again, with no air conditioning. So where does this standard come from?
Such a good example. Like also the not considering the life cycle of that art object. Like once you sell it, what happens, right? Like do people like build their homes under the same like conditions? Not really. So I think it's such a short-sighted like way of like looking into things. And it's the problem that is being created is almost like, you bring an animal to a zoo in a total different country, and then you're trying to create the living conditions for that animal there. And they're like, well, maybe they shouldn't be there in the first place. So I think, again, going back to that, like questioning and then reframing the problem, right? Like, what is the real issue that we're trying to address here? Or is this even an issue? Like, are we creating this issue ourselves? We definitely need that type of like thinking and reframing more and more in our practice today to kind of like really break our habits that are like just bad habits, right? And then unlearn some of the things that maybe were almost a little bit like brainwashed to us like during like education. I mean, I think I can ask you questions all day, but I do want to be mindful of your time too. So I have one more question before asking your advice. What do you think is next for WOROFILA? What are you most excited about these days?
So these days, we're quite excited about an impending project of ours, which we've called the Labo Fou, which is an invitation for us to rethink how we build, to really actually deconstruct all components of the building, from the foundation to the plumbing systems, to our relationship to sanitation, to energy, to, you know, thinking in our context, what is a window? You know, what does a window need to do? So then how do we design a window? And all of this is actually stemmed from the realization that we, in the last 6 years, we've made, you know, quite a few buildings, let's say about 10, which are really beautiful prototypes. And we just say prototypes because we realized that as much as it kind of showed it displayed a lot of our creativity and showcasing what can be done with earth in terms of constructive systems, we still feel that for the context in which we are, they're still very complex and are not very susceptible to be reproduced. So, for instance, when we have a load-bearing earthen brick walls, we have to very carefully look at the way in which the bricks are put together so that we don't have any vertical joints and that the wall really is one, etc. And we usually actually draw every single course, and then we're on site having to have people lay the bricks, like, you know, like without mortar, and then we fix it, and then, you know, they actually relate, etc. So it requires a lot of supervision, and we are in a context in which most people build without architects, and most people just build with cement because that's what is everywhere and that's what is easy at the end of the day. You don't need to have an education to know that you can just buy a bag of cement, have a bit of sand, water, and a mold, and then you read the recipe at the back of the bag of cement, and then, you know, you make the bricks. It's really as simple, and you make the bricks without even knowing what you're going to build because you know that you're going to need these bricks later down the line. That's just the reality. So when we kind of when we are operating within that context, we have to rethink the fact that we are at a point where we've used materials that sure are natural and bio-based, but require a kind of certain knowledge and a certain education and a certain level of even industrialization, because these bricks are made with a press. A press has to be well calibrated, and usually in our case, they sort of come from a factory. Sure, they're sun-dried and do not require electricity, but, you know, it still requires certain knowledge. So all of that just to say that with this project of the Labo Fou, which we're doing with in the context of a practice lab with the ReArch Institute, we've identified a site of what will be, let's say, a probably expanding city in Senegal, because there's a new train line going through the city, and we're designing the train station. It's going to be all in compressed and stabilized earth bricks, but we wanted to use that place almost as a laboratory to showcase how else we can build, but using much, much lower technologies, and really anchoring ourselves in the territory by mapping all the materials that are there, all the knowledge systems that are there as well, to really create a kind of model of construction that truly empowers the people. And I think for us as well, it's a challenge to have to sort of simplify the way in which we build, and really, like I say again, deconstruct everything to really go to what is essential at the end of the day, kind of in line with everything that we've spoken about. We want to always keep a certain criticality and never fall into this idea that there's a recipe for how to build, you know, that we found the system and we can just apply it everywhere. How can we, by anchoring ourselves in a particular territory, which is an urban territory, but it's a place that also has loads of laterite. So how can we really rethink the constructive system to be specific to the area and to be able to be transmitted to the people at the end of the day as well. So it has to be simple enough in order to do that.
I love that. I feel like a lot of the fact that we kind of like sit on a lot of the expertise almost like disassociates people from the process. But then again, if they're more involved, then maybe they also have like more responsibility in what places they live in or exist in, right? And I think having kind of that like education towards them and making this more accessible to a broader, like that's what we were talking about in terms of how does this scale, right? And you're giving the answer there right there, and it's extremely exciting. We're very much looking forward to, you know, seeing how the realization of it. And I think it's actually it's a benchmark to the world, really, on how we practice architecture, not only like for ourselves, but also like together with people. In the end, these spaces are for people and they're built by people. And how do we engage them in the process? All right, last question. So for people in any field who want to kind of shake things up a little bit and rethink things and push the boundaries a little bit, what would be your advice to them?
I would say, yeah, to have a critical mindset and to question everything, really, to question the status quo, to question the standards, to question what we deem to be tradition as well, to really investigate where those traditions come from. Often we'll be surprised that they're not that old and they're not, accidental either. And ultimately to also question ourselves, really, in our work, to be open to actually learn from it, to be able to also accept failure or a certain amount of shortcomings, because that's what pushes us to go towards much more improved solutions, and to also keep on learning and perfecting our craft. So I know that for us at WOROFILA, we especially with my partner, but as a team, we talk a lot about the failures. We talk a lot about the fact that, and some people may not even deem what we see as failures, but when we realize, for instance, that we've put a detail that was way too complicated to implement, we just think that maybe we should do away with it, or actually just find something that works simpler. When we realize that the way in which we communicate, for instance, through certain drawings and details, aren't understood, we sort of favored the fact that we go on site and actually do the prototypes with the people and just have that level of pedagogy. So we're not really, kind of stuck in very rigorous or very rigid, not rigorous, very rigid way of doing things, because I think our vision is also quite clear, and we just aim to make architecture that is actually just a lot more positive for the people and also for our country, because at the end of the day, we're trying to also empower ourselves, right, by relying on our own cultures and know-hows. And we are open to anything that kind of goes in that direction. And we just see ourselves as agents. We're here, for a time only. We have many other collaborators as well that help. That's another advice that I'll give, is that we've worked with historians, sociologists, scientists, government building, masons, artisans themselves as well, that are a repository of a lot of knowledge. And at the end of the day, are often the hands that are actually doing the work. So it's very important to also be able to have that mediation and contact in order to learn with the people at the end of the day that are on site, and sometimes also have years and years of knowledge on a particular material or particular technique. So yes, I think we try to remain open-minded. We try to also have fun with it, because they are really great people stories of collaborations as well. And but yeah, I would say criticality is the biggest one. And also, yes, in our case, collaboration has helped a lot to be able to not just figure everything out by ourselves, learn from the people also that came before us and the people that are with us as well. My dad once said that our collective, even though the collective isn't, formally still a thing, he still sees the ecosystem as a collective. And he told me that in ancient Egypt, there was a term to describe what is an academy, and it's a sort of place in which you learn from the peers. So there's a lot of horizontal learnings. And he said that that's kind of what we have. We are all taking our abilities as architects, as engineers, as material scientists, as artisans, to actually come together and learn from each other. And it's a really beautiful way to learn as well. So back to what you were saying about the top-down approach, even to learning, we're all learning in situ from each other and together. So
I love that. I think, I mean, it's a beautiful advice, and I think it's you are all a model to the world in terms of like really staying students and having a growth mindset, and in the end, really challenge ourselves to just become better versions of who we are today and like what we do in our work. So
Absolutely.
thank you for everything you do and creating these like beautiful case examples for both your country and for the world really. And we very much look forward to see what you are going to create next. And yeah, I recommend all the audience to look through all the projects that you talked about. We'll definitely add it on the links.
Okay. And by then we'll have the website updated as well.
Yay.
And do a better job at communicating on our project, because sometimes we're too busy actually doing the work that we forget to
Of
communicate.
course,
It's
people who
really
are doing
important.
the work are not the best in promoting themselves.
No,
Yeah,
no,
yeah,
no.
yeah.
But
That's why
it's
we're here.
important. It's important mostly for students, and anybody who just wants to learn and be inspired. It's also why we do this, is that it's really critical that we share our experience with everybody and also welcome people to also share the work that they do with us. We are, the perpetual students. So yes, please reach out, even just to have a conversation. It would be a great pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you, Zinga. This was such a treat.
Thank you, Pinar.
You. And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.